In the heart of rural America during the 1950s, life unfolded under vast skies that seemed to stretch forever. But beneath that open expanse lay a world of relentless toil and quiet desperation that the glossy magazines of the era rarely captured. Picture a typical morning on a small farm in the Midwest or the South, say, in Iowa or Alabama, where the first light of dawn pierced through thin curtains made from flour sacks, rousing families from beds that often accommodated multiple siblings in a single room. The air carried the sharp scent of dew on cornfields or cotton rows, and the day began not with a leisurely coffee but with chores that had been the rhythm of existence for generations. Farmers like those in Cullman County, Alabama, would rise before the sun, their bodies already attuned to the grind, knowing that the land demanded everything and gave back just enough to survive, if you were lucky. It wasn't the idyllic pastoral scene painted in Hollywood films. It was a battle against soil that could turn fickle, markets that swung like pendulums, and a society that was rapidly leaving the countryside behind. Post-World War II, the 1950s dawned with a veneer of prosperity for American agriculture. The war had ended in 1945, and the Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, funneled U.S. farm surpluses to a devastated Europe, boosting exports from around $2 billion in the late 1940s to nearly $4 billion by 1950. This helped feed millions overseas and padded farmers' pockets back home, with President Harry Truman himself noting that farmers had achieved an economic position better than ever before. But this boom was fleeting, like a summer rain that evaporates too quickly. By the early 1950s, especially after the Korean War wrapped up in 1953, surpluses piled up, prices plummeted, and the government scrambled with programs to curb production and find new markets. Farm expenses skyrocketed, from an average of $6,622 per year in 1940 to over $23,000 by 1952, driven by inflation and the need to invest in new technologies. For many rural families, this meant scraping by on incomes that barely covered the basics, with net earnings sometimes dipping below $2,000 annually for operations like dairy farming. You'd hear stories of farmers like Bill Hammer Jr. in the Midwest, who milked cows and grew feed on 335 acres but still needed off-farm jobs at feed mills or factories to make ends meet. It was a far cry from the Golden Age narrative, more like fool's gold that glittered but didn't last. Hard work defined every aspect of rural life, a ceaseless cycle that started with the crow of a rooster and ended only when exhaustion claimed you. On a typical farm, men, and often women and children, would head to the fields at first light. In the South, cotton picking was a grueling ritual, especially in October when the bolls burst open like white popcorn. Kids as young as 6, in places like rural Alabama, dragged long sacks through the rows, their small hands pricking on thorns, enduring cold mornings that turned into sweltering afternoons without the luxury of sunscreen or even hats. They'd earn a meager $3 or $4 a day, enough for a simple lunch of Vienna sausages and crackers washed down with water from a shared jug. The work wasn't just physical, it was mental, a constant calculation of yields versus costs. In the Midwest, corn and wheat demanded similar devotion. Plowing with tractors that had replaced mules but still required hours of bone-jarring labor. Tractors, by 1954, outnumbered horses and mules on farms, a technological shift that promised efficiency but often meant debt for those who could afford the machines. Families raised chickens for eggs, kept cows for milk, churning butter by hand if electricity hadn't reached their hollow yet, and tended gardens bursting with tomatoes, beans, and okra to stretch their food supplies. Evenings brought more tasks: mending fences, repairing equipment, or preserving food in mason jars for winter. It was the kind of hard work that built character, or so the elders said, but it also broke backs and spirits, with little room for error in a world where a drought could wipe out a year's effort. Poverty lurked in the shadows of these farms, more pervasive than the dust kicked up by passing trucks on gravel roads. Rural America had higher poverty rates than urban areas throughout the decade, with families often living in shotgun shacks or weathered farmhouses lacking indoor plumbing. Outhouses were standard, and running water a luxury that might arrive only in the late 1950s via rural electrification programs. In West Virginia's coal-adjacent rural pockets, families like those in Wyoming County subsisted without modern conveniences, drawing water from wells and relying on wood stoves for heat. The Great Depression scars lingered. Adults who had survived it clung to small family farms, resisting the pull of cities, but economic realities forced compromises. Many supplemented farm income with off-farm work, driving to nearby towns for factory shifts or, in the South, commuting to steel mills in Birmingham. Government interventions helped somewhat. The Food for Peace program in 1954 distributed surpluses abroad, stabilizing prices, and by the 1960s, food stamps piloted in 1961 offered relief to the needy. But for millions, poverty meant patched clothes, hand-me-down shoes, and meals heavy on cornbread and beans. It wasn't the dramatic starvation of the 1930s Dust Bowl, but a grinding want that eroded dreams. Humorously enough, folks might joke that their savings account was the change jar on the kitchen shelf, but the laughter was thin, masking the fear of losing the farm to foreclosure. Amid this toil, the baby boom added both joy and strain to rural households. Birth rates peaked in the late 1950s, with fertility at 118 per 1,000 women by 1960, leading to neighborhoods teeming with kids. Imagine a farm lane with 23 children under 12, as one Nebraska woman recalled. These boomers grew up amid the quiet pastoral life, playing in barns or fishing in creeks, but they also absorbed the era's underlying fears. The Cold War cast a long shadow. Rural areas, especially in the Great Plains, became targets for Soviet ICBMs, with missile silos dotting fields like ominous sentinels. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, and the escalating Vietnam conflict pulled young men away, accelerating the exodus from farms. Families like William Loeb's in Nebraska saw brothers and sons drafted, turning plowshares into swords in a literal sense. Television, infiltrating most homes by the late 1960s, 96% of households, with families watching over 6 hours daily, brought images of distant wars and urban glamour, luring the youth away. Farm populations plummeted from 23 million, 16% of the U.S., in 1950 to an older demographic by 1970, with the median age rising as kids left for city opportunities or military service. Technological progress promised salvation but often deepened divides. The Green Revolution kicked off with dwarf wheat varieties developed by USDA scientists, boosting yields dramatically. Corn jumped from 30 to 60 bushels per acre by 1960. Chemical fertilizers and pesticides like DDT accounted for over half of productivity gains from 1940 to 1955, allowing one farmer to feed 25.8 people by the 1960s, up from 15.5 in the 1950s. Mechanical cotton pickers and self-propelled combines reduced labor needs, but smaller farms couldn't afford them, leading to consolidation. Average farm size grew from 216 acres in the 1950s to 303 in the 1960s, while the number of farms dropped from over 5 million to under 4 million. This get big or get out mentality, as some called it, favored agribusiness over family operations. Environmental costs were emerging secrets. DDT's harms to wildlife wouldn't lead to a ban until 1972, but rural folks noticed thinning bird populations and tainted water. The Interstate Highway Act of 1956 connected farms to markets but also facilitated migration, making it easier to leave the countryside for suburban dreams. Social life in rural America offered respite from the drudgery, though it was simple and community-bound. In places like Center Hill, Alabama, weekends meant family visits on porches, swapping stories over sweet tea, or Saturday night gatherings with guitars and banjos strumming old hymns and folk tunes. Card games like Rook provided entertainment, and early television shows such as The Lawrence Welk Show brought a touch of the outside world into living rooms. Church was the anchor, often a single Baptist or Methodist building serving the hollow, with Sunday services drawing the crowd, though midweek prayer meetings were sparser. Funerals were communal affairs, bodies embalmed at home, families sitting with the dead overnight, a vigil that blended grief with neighborly support. Marriages came early, often in the late teens, reflecting a conservative ethos where risks were avoided. Folks stuck to what they knew, farming the same way their grandparents had, even as the world changed. There was a wry humor in it all. A farmer might quip that the only social network was the party line telephone, where neighbors eavesdropped on calls, turning gossip into an art form. Yet, Beneath this surface camaraderie simmered untold secrets that history books often gloss over, particularly the deep racial inequalities that fractured rural society. In the 1950s, segregation wasn't just an urban issue. It permeated the countryside, enforced by Jim Crow laws and federal policies that systematically disadvantaged black rural Americans. Government housing programs from the New Deal era, extended into the post-war years, created a state-sponsored system of segregation. The Federal Housing Administration, FHA, established in 1934, redlined African American neighborhoods as risky, refusing to insure mortgages there while subsidizing white-only suburbs. Developments like Levittown in Pennsylvania or Daly City near San Francisco explicitly barred black buyers, with FHA manuals mandating separation of incompatible racial groups. In rural areas, this meant black farmers were denied loans and land opportunities, exacerbating poverty. Black rural families, descendants of enslaved people who had built the agricultural backbone of the South, owned 14 million acres by 1910, but by the 1950s, violence, discriminatory laws like the Torrens Act, and economic exploitation had begun a steep decline. Land loss accelerated, dropping to under 2 million acres by the late 20th century. Racial terror was another hidden scar. Lynchings, though peaking earlier, continued into the 1950s in rural pockets, often targeting black economic success. Events like the 1898 Wilmington Massacre in North Carolina, where a white mob killed hundreds and overthrew a black-led government, echoed in the era's suppressions. Sharecropping trapped black families in debt cycles, a post-slavery exploitation where they farmed land they didn't own, paying exorbitant shares that left them destitute. Education was a battleground. Anti-literacy laws from slavery days lingered in effect, and even after Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 declared segregation unconstitutional, rural schools resisted integration, delaying black access to quality education until the 1960s. Healthcare disparities were stark. The infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, running from 1932 to 1972, withheld treatment from black men in rural Alabama, fostering deep mistrust. Criminal justice routes traced to slave patrols, evolving into over-policing and harsher sentences for black rural residents. Stories of resilience, like those of civil rights leader John Lewis marching from Selma in 1965 amid 1950s rooted voting suppression, highlight the fight, but many voices remained forgotten. Black rural Americans faced higher unemployment, limited job opportunities, and compounded poverty. Rates of diabetes and other ailments soared due to food insecurity and systemic neglect. Gender roles added another layer of unspoken hardship. Women in rural 1950s America were the unsung heroes, managing households while contributing to farm labor. They churned butter, canned vegetables, and raised children amid isolation. No mom groups or daycare, just the grind. The Women's Land Army from World War II had shown their capabilities, but post-war norms pushed them back to domestic spheres, though many worked off-farm as the decade progressed, with female employment rising 50%. By 1969, girls could join the Future Farmers of America, FFA, a small crack in the patriarchal structure. Mental health struggles were taboo. The isolation of farm life led to unspoken depressions, with no therapists in sight, just the bottle or the Bible for solace. Environmental secrets were brewing too. The heavy use of chemicals like DDT polluted streams and soils, a legacy that would haunt future generations, but in the 1950s, it was hailed as progress. As the decade wore on, the rural exodus intensified. Young boomers, enticed by urban jobs and the allure of suburbs, left behind aging parents and emptying towns. Supermarkets dominated food distribution, sidelining small farmers, while changing diets. TV dinners in 1954, fast food chains, reflected a shift away from homegrown meals. Programs like school lunches and milk initiatives combated malnutrition, but rural poverty persisted, with rates higher than in cities. President Johnson's Great Society in the 1960s expanded aid, but the 1950s laid the groundwork for these interventions. In the end, rural America in the 1950s was a tapestry of endurance, where hard work met harsh realities, and secrets of inequality festered beneath the surface. It wasn't all doom. There were moments of community warmth, like a barn dance or a bountiful harvest feast, where laughter rang out against the odds. But to romanticize it fully would ignore the truth. For many, it was a life of poverty that demanded everything, gave little, and hid pains that shaped the nation in ways we're still unraveling today. The tractor emoji in modern nostalgia? It's a cute nod, but back then, that machine was both savior and symbol of a world slipping away, one furrow at a time. The migration patterns tell a poignant story. By 1960, the farm population had dropped to 15.6 million from 25 million in 1950, with farmers comprising just 8.3% of the labor force. This wasn't voluntary wanderlust. It was economic necessity. Small farms couldn't compete with agribusiness giants, bolstered by federal subsidies that disproportionately favored larger operations. In the tobacco belt, for instance, changes in control programs squeezed out smallholders, pushing them toward urban factories or service jobs. Rural youth, drafted into Korea or Vietnam, often didn't return, opting for GI Bill education in cities. Women, too, sought independence. The rise in working mothers reflected not just need but a quiet rebellion against farm isolation. Anecdotes abound. A Nebraska farm wife recalling how her boomer kids had opportunities she never dreamed of, like college or travel, while she stayed rooted to the land. Economically, the 1950s were a roller coaster. Early prosperity from wartime demands gave way to overproduction woes. Corn prices, for example, fluctuated wildly, forcing farmers to diversify or perish. Government payments doubled under Kennedy, reaching $1.7 billion by 1962, but this was a band-aid on a gaping wound. Rural electrification, completed in many areas by the mid-1950s, brought lights and appliances, easing some burdens, like no more hand-washing clothes in tubs, but it also highlighted disparities, as poorer families lagged. In the South, where cotton was king, mechanical pickers displaced laborers, exacerbating unemployment among black and poor white workers. The drought of the early 1950s, biting without much bark in policy response, ravaged yields, though technological fixes like center pivot irrigation emerged later. Socially, the era's conservatism masked progressive undercurrents. Church picnics and county fairs were highlights, where homemade pies competed and kids rode Ferris wheels powered by generators. But racial divides poisoned these events. Segregated seating or outright exclusions were common in rural venues. Black rural communities built their own networks, churches doubling as schools until desegregation trickled in. Untold stories include the land theft, discriminatory USDA loans denied to black farmers, leading to foreclosures and sales at a fraction of value. By the 1950s, this systemic erosion meant black-owned farms dwindled, their owners migrating north in the Great Migration's tail end, seeking industrial jobs but facing urban redlining there too. Health and environment added hidden layers. The Tuskegee experiment's shadow loomed, deterring medical care. Pesticides like DDT, sprayed liberally, caused immediate ills. Farmers reported skin rashes and respiratory issues, but long-term cancers and ecosystem damage were secrets unfolding slowly. Mental health? A farmer's bad day might mean staring at barren fields, but therapy was for city folk. Stoicism ruled, with alcohol or overwork as outlets. In wrapping this narrative, consider the legacy. The 1950s rural America forged modern agriculture but at great human cost. Poverty wasn't just financial. It was the poverty of opportunity, the hard work that yielded diminishing returns, and secrets of inequality that perpetuated divisions. Yet, in the resilience of those who stayed, planting seeds amid adversity, there's a quiet heroism. It's a chapter worth remembering, not with rose-tinted glasses, but with clear eyes on the truths it holds.